This is The Second Studio, hosted by the Architecture and Design Office fame. My name is David Lee, and with me is Marina Borderonay. The two of us are architects, partners at the office, and of course, hosts of the show. And today, we're doing a part 2 or 3 or 4, I forget where we're at, of the fire rebuild effort in Los Angeles. We do tend to talk more about the Palisades because that's what we know more than Altadena, but a lot of the things we have to say apply to all fire rebuilds. And that's the recording. Sponsors.
This episode of The Second Studio is brought to you by BQE Core, the all-in-one firm management software built for architects. Designed by architects for architects, Core helps you track time effortlessly, manage projects seamlessly, and get paid faster so you can focus on design, not spreadsheets. With powerful automation and real-time insights, it's everything you need to run a smarter, more profitable firm. See how BQE Core can transform your practice by clicking the link in our show notes. Available with Revit version 2023.1 onward, Autodesk Insight is a next-generation carbon analysis tool that can help you make the leap to low-carbon design. With only a few clicks, Insight lets you analyze, understand, and track the embodied and operational carbon impact of your design choices. You can then visualize opportunities for energy efficiency and carbon mitigation with its flexible dashboards, helping you make more sustainable and informed decisions. Check out the Insight link in our show notes to find out more.
This is The Second Studio with the two of us. Here we go.
So it's crazy to think that it's been, over 9 months now since the fire happened. Mm-hmm. It's weird too because it feels like it was yesterday. And at the same time, it's been like almost a year. And when you drive through the Palisades, it's not that much has happened, but it takes time for that kind of situation to show progress and movement, right? The good thing is that things are happening in the Palisades. Mm-hmm. A few months ago, there were still a lot of sites that hadn't been cleared. So the debris, the ashes, and all of that was still there. Most of the sites now have been cleared. So it kind of feels good driving through it because you feel like, okay, it's a clean slate and life is coming back and things are moving and
we're prepped.
It's moving forward. So that's super exciting. You can even see the construction trucks starting to be there and construction crew and framing and, things going up. So it's, it feels good. But it still takes a lot of time to move forward. The one thing that I was wondering is it still seems like there is not like a centered hub that has all of the information that a homeowner who lost their house in the Palisades would need to rebuild or sell or decide what to do between the two.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a weird thing. Like I feel like the city would have put something in place, or maybe the community has some sort of small things in place, but it seems to me like you need to put a building or a temporary structure there with people who have the right information for anyone who needs help figuring things out to go to and not have to figure out where to go.
It's funny. This is a separate sort of tangent, but someone also remarked to me recently that what they should have done or should be doing now is having a therapy kind of relief center as well to help people cross the trauma, because that's very real. And going to therapy is much more common these days, and there's less stigma. But it would be great if there was a free version of that for everyone who lost their houses. But to your question, there are a lot of these miniature hubs that are by the government, by professionals, by the community, by community members who've started their own websites, folks hosting events, real estate agents, like everyone's doing their bits, and we're doing our bit with our show. The reason why, or rather the challenge with having a central hub of information really gets to the core challenges of doing a project anyway, regardless of whether or not it's a fire rebuild. And that is, there are a lot of different ways a house can be done and a lot of different ways to execute a project. And there's a lot of detailed information with all of it. So the reality of having a kind of master hub of sorts, it would be so much information. And also you'd have to somehow include a dozen or more different professionals who each do things differently, but are really qualified and know their information and what to do. And that's just, it's unlikely. I think, to be honest, I think the closest thing to a central hub of deep dive information that clients should really know before making a decision about a project is probably our podcast, not just the fire rebuild episodes, but the entire thing. I've never come across a database, let's say, that actually provides insider, in-depth information about how things work, the pros and cons of different routes, and the pitfalls of some of these things outside of our show. And the reason why is it's just a lot. And our show is not for everybody. You know, our recordings are an hour, hour and a half, sometimes a little bit longer. And most of the boards that you see, the centers, it's like an hour and a half conversation, we can cover a lot of information, and we've been doing it for 400 and something episodes. The types of pamphlets and informational guides that are given in a lot of these community things are pamphlets, and it's not it's for me, with who I am, that's like not enough information for it to be really valuable to know how to move forward. And I think that's the challenge, because again, if you're a client and you've never done any of this, and then you pick up a phone and you call 10 different contractors, you get 10 different prices, 10 different ways of doing things. And they also structure their process differently. And they say you need different professionals. Yeah. Some contractors say, like, you don't need an architect because you don't, by the house size that you're trying to build. Some will say, I have an architect in-house. Some will say, oh, I have an architect friend. Some will say, you have to have an architect. And others will say, you have to have an architect who also provides construction documentation and CA. And those are, half a dozen different things already. And you have another contractor who says, like, well, I'm a prefab company, or some other variation. So it's just like an abundance of information. And I actually think that is probably the biggest challenge that all these fire victims have faced, is it's just so much information coming at them, or they're having to seek out. Mm-hmm. Which is not like anyone's fault, but I think that's the reality, and we're just talking about the design and construction of the house. We're not talking about insurance, about, months ago, finding clothes, finding a place to live, all of these things. It's, I can only imagine how overwhelming it would be.
Yeah, no, and you actually have spent a lot of time on the phone with fire victims who were potentially looking to rebuild. I mean, you had, I don't know how many phone calls. Yeah. And I feel like you probably have heard kind of the same questions, or like you probably saw patterns from this conversation. Like, where are people's mind at? What are the things that they are asking you about, and all those things?
Yeah, so yes, I've had a lot of phone calls. The phone calls I have with people tend to be on the longer side, because, as you can tell from the podcast, I like to talk. And also talking about process and the details of things is I find it interesting. And I also personally think it's necessary for a client to understand before they make a decision. So in an odd way, I have, when I do onboarding calls with clients, or pre-onboarding calls, this initial cold call session, I more assume the role of an owner's rep than I do an architect who's trying to pitch our office to somebody. Mm-hmm. And that's because truly, and I think a lot of architects would agree with this, I don't want to engage in a relationship and embark on a project if it's not the right fit. Even if I like the person, they have a good budget, and a lot of the things are aligned in paper, but there's something else that makes it that we're not the right fit, or they don't want to work with us, they found someone else they prefer. They should 100% go with that other person. Because again, these projects last, 2-3 years or whatever it is. It's not worth it for anybody to start on something when it wasn't the right pairing. So my approach, let's say, is more to be as unbiased as possible, just provide information and an overview and answer as many questions as possible. And then we can talk about how I work as an office, how we work, and if it makes sense, then we go from there. The questions I get from people are, everything from budget to schedule to even bigger things of like, what's the correct process and method and team to put together to execute a project, ranging from 5 different prefab companies who all operate differently, to hiring again to design build as category 2, to category 3, the traditional route of hiring an architect, but category 3 of hiring an architect and a contractor, the traditional method of custom home building. That splinters off into 4 different methods as well, depending on the architect you're hiring, the services they provide, the contractor, what they actually do, the quality. So the number of again, options is staggering. And I just try to do my best to explain at a high level the pros and cons of all of those things. based on, though, the parameters that the potential client has given me. So yes, I can speak up about those things broadly, but the reality of whether or not one of those three paths and what variation within those three paths makes sense for a person is hyper dependent on their situation. So it's always the big parameters of the scope, the budget, and the schedule. In this case, because of insurance reasons for a lot of people, the schedule and the budget are very critical and immovable parameters, right? So that predefines a lot of things. Now we throw into the other third factor, which is equally important, is the client's personality and expectations for what level of house they want to get. If a client says to me, I have a tight budget, tight schedule, like a lot of fire rebuilds, I'm less particular about the design. Like, I really need a residence to be in, so I'm not homeless. Then that changes things. If they say, I've always wanted to do a house. I love, in our case, I love modern design. I've always wanted something that's more specific to me. I do have a tight schedule and budget, but but this other thing's a priority for me. If we can't achieve a house that is unique and cool, then I'm just going to go, buy a house somewhere else and move on to the next chapter, so to speak. Then that also that rules out a bunch of options for them automatically. Yeah. And so, going back to the subject, to the question of like the community hub information thing, what happens is, and I've talked about this with other professionals, and I've seen this across a lot of fire rebuild victims. What happens is that when you are a person who's getting hit with all these different alternates and you know nothing about these industries, all of the answers you hear from the different professionals, from your neighbors, from the Slack groups and the whatever else, they all become weighted equally in your mind, and you don't know who to trust.
Yeah.
Because why would you know who to trust if everyone's giving different answers? And that is the part that's really challenging. The way to get around that is to, when you're speaking with people and getting information, err on the side of having longer and more in-depth and detailed and holistic conversations about what you're trying to achieve. And that's the only way you'll be able to compare apples to apples. So it's very common for someone to say to me, a resident to say to me, well, I heard this prefab company says that X, Y, and Z things about what they do and how things work in general. And I'll say, yeah, that could make sense. But again, let's have 10 minutes and talk about your situation, what you're trying to do, and then compare what they're saying with that. Because if you don't do that, it's just baseless information, and you're comparing things that should not be compared to each other. Well, so-and-so architect does it that way, or so-and-so contractor does it that way. But did you have a conversation with them about more than just that surface level? Do they actually understand what you're trying to do? No and no. Well, then it's kind of useless information. Like I said before in the podcast, trust needs to start somewhere, and it's difficult to do if you don't know anything, but it's impossible to do if you don't decide to, again, stretch the conversation and get a little bit more into the weeds. Because if we think about the fact that in a project, if an architect's involved or anyone's involved, the big decision maker, designer, architect, there's about 70,000 decisions we make in the course of an average project. 70,000 decisions. So somebody is going to have to make those decisions, whether it's an architect or the contractor or the client, or someone's going to have to do it. And again, when you think about the number of variables with that magnitude of decisions, you splinter off again into 100 different ways of doing things. And I just think that it's very easy for professionals to wrongly give surface level information and say, this is a fact. This is how it works. You must do this, without knowing someone's position and their parameters.
Well, it's kind of like if there was that hub of information in the Palisades and Altadena, for example, it's almost like you would need that hub to have like a triage process. Like you go to the ER. Well, you might not need stitches, or you might need surgery, or you might just need a Band-Aid. It kind of depends, but you need to be triaged to the right room and professionals. Otherwise, you might end up getting a surgery you didn't need. Or you might end up, getting a Band-Aid on a wound that's never going to close on its own. So it's kind of also like the thing that's hard for people to grasp, I think, on our profession is the wide range of how people provide the services that we all provide.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about a matchmaking too. It's about a matchmaking based on their situation, based on their personality, based on their expectation. Throw in the insurance, the schedule, and the budget on top of that. Like, it's not simple. It's not simple.
It's not simple, and it is, and I think I've said it before on the podcast, I think it's the greatest challenge our industry faces.
Yeah.
Industries, if we
There's
bundle
not
AEC
one way
together.
to do things.
There's not one way to do things, and it's like the challenge is, how do we help educate and inform clients so they make the right decision?
Mm-hmm.
That is fundamentally the question, because even with all that what I said, you cannot really expect the average person to consume 450 episodes of a podcast or consume 40 hours of lecture information, memorize it, digest it, comprehend it, and be like, okay, now that I have that, now I can make a decision. So how do we do that? And for me, at least, we have the show, but I also do phone calls very often with people. I'll give an example of one piece of information that floats around that is oftentimes easily misleading, and we can talk about this more and later on in the recording too. It's construction cost per square foot. So there's a lot of reasons why that is used as a metric for good reasons, and there's a lot of reasons why that oftentimes is a very misleading metric. One, it's very easy for if I'm a potential client to have a quick conversation with my neighbor's contractor, or my neighbor who spoke to their contractor. The neighbor says, "Oh yeah, our construction cost was $550 a square foot." Now that goes in my brain as $550 a square foot is one of the points of metric and information of the many I've gotten before. So now when I talk to someone else, an architect or contractor, well, someone said $550 a square foot. What's missing from that $550 is what was the schedule, what was the budget, what was the design quality, who was the contractor? Are they a spec builder contractor that takes all kinds of shortcuts on the inside of walls and floorings and structures that you don't see? Are they going cheap with materials? What was the execution level? In addition, here's another one. Sometimes the cost per square foot is described as, I've heard contractors say cost per square foot to mean
core and shell.
What we'd say like the core and shell, or just the architecture. So more practically, what that means for people listening, it means the structure's done, the framing's done, drywall's up, and the outside is sheathed, and cladding on the outside is done, or it's on its way. That's like it's not really core and shell, but that's a phrase we could use. What's missing is all the interior build outs. So we don't have any cabinets, we don't have any sinks, we don't have any toilets, we don't have any tile. We do have the wood flooring because that's part of like the rough core and shell architecture. But all the interior stuff is missing. Landscaping's not part of that. Pool's not part of that. A bunch of stuff is not part of that. And so I was talking to one contractor, and because the client said to me, "Oh, well, I have this contractor, and he says I could do the house for $350 a square foot." And by the way, taking a step back, for people listening, these are California, LA numbers. I get that if you're in like Nebraska or Tennessee, the numbers are crazy high. This is relative to this market. And so 350 is, anyone in LA knows, that's like, how is that even possible? So I said, okay. I said to the client, I'm very skeptical of that number for a high-end, or not high-end, like a luxury high-end house for $350. That makes no sense to me, like at all. Like you're a third, off, or you're 60% off rather. So I said, well, let me do this. Let me talk to your contractor. So I call the contractor, have a conversation, again, go a little bit further and say, okay, the client mentioned something like $350 a square foot. Like, talk me through, how does that work? How do you work? And yeah, it was revealed that he meant core and shell, not including the interior build out, not including landscaping, not including the driveway, not including the pool, there's all that other stuff. I'm like, right, okay, that makes a lot more sense. It's still low, but it makes a lot more sense. So what's your like ballpark, generally speaking, for the houses you do, all inclusive for the house itself? Forget the landscape and pool, because that can vary. Oh, it's like 550, 600. Okay, well, that is more plausible. And then I go back to the client and say, yeah, by the way, this 350 you've been using, that's not accurate whatsoever. So again, a relatively quick example of the cost per square foot varies so much. And also, again, does that include all the other outside stuff I was describing? Sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. So I think as a client or a resident, you need to be very careful when you get tidbits of information that are easy to like memorize, because there's a story behind those. And you really should know what that story is if you're going to make a good decision. Because it is unfortunate that very often people will hire contractor, designer, architect based on that factoid and not know the rest.
No. There is also some updates from the city, like since the fire happened, the building planning department kind of went through maybe a few changes from what was originally said.
Yeah.
And this potentially changes drastically what you can submit.
Yeah.
And it sucks for people who submitted stuff right away, because they probably
the rules have changed.
Probably could have got more out of that project.
Yeah. So the city has released a series of updates since January, and the good thing is that, broadly speaking, those updates and the new and the restrictions and the parameters for what you can do has loosened up. And so they've made the process and the filing process and the rebuilding process like easier and easier and easier. The other good thing is that we've gotten to a point now, it's now October, that the regulations of what you can and cannot do as a fire rebuild are much more solidified. So we don't know what the city is going to do, but I don't think they're going to more drastically change the parameters like they did in the past. Mm-hmm. So for the people who are starting now, it's a good thing because we pretty much know what we can do, and the city's made it easier. To dive into some of the specifics though, so one of the big topics of conversation, of course, throughout the last 9 months has been how you rebuild and how you file that mm-hmm. new project. Is it a like-for-like rebuild, which means that it's similar to what was there before, whatever that means, which we'll talk about? Or is it a new construction project which ignores completely what was there before and you're doing something like different? In the like-for-like method of filing and type of project, previously, it meant you could build 110% of the previous square footage. That was the thing everyone was talking about, as a percentage, additional 10% of the square footage. Now, the rules for like-to-like have nothing to do directly with a square footage limitation of the house. So I'm going to repeat that. The like-for-like parameters have nothing to do directly with the limitation of the total square footage of the house. The like-for-like parameters only specify a maximum allowable size of the footprint of the building and then the height. So it's the footprint and the height. So within that bubble, let's say, you can do whatever you want. And that's important because mostly if you had a two-story house previously. So let's imagine there was previously a two-story house. The ground level was, just to keep math simple, 1,000 square feet. Mm-hmm. Okay. And the second level was 500 square feet. So a 1,500 square foot house in total. Before, in the old rules, you can only add 150 square feet to that, right? 110% of 1,500 is 1,650. And we maxed out at that. The new rule set is the footprint, which is 1,000 square feet. Let's just keep it simple because the first floor was 1,000 square feet, can be an extra 10%. So now we're at 1,100 square feet. And that's where you're limited the footprint and you're limited at the previous height. The previous height was dictated by the second level. And that creates a height datum, a line that goes across the entire site. So what it means is that you could now build in the like-for-like definition 1,100 square feet at the ground level and 1,100 square feet on the upper level, right? Because you're still within that bubble that I described. You're still within the footprint and you're still within the maximum height.
Yeah, the only caveat with that is that you still have to comply to your maximum residential floor area, so known as RFA. Yep. And that is what's going to limit how much square footage you can build.
Absolutely. So the way that the code works generally, and this is why it gets confusing, is that there are segments and pieces of the code that say, okay, you're allowed to do this per this chapter. There's another chapter that overlaps on top of that or also applies. Mm-hmm. So the like-for-like parameter, this 110% of footprint and height, does not mean that all other parameters regarding height and area and everything else and lot coverage don't apply. They still get layered on top of that. So,
and then sometimes you also have another thin layer, which is the HOA, which might also have, its limitations. So the thing that's gonna basically drive what you can do is whichever is the most stringent on the restriction.
The most stringent.
What you're gonna have to follow.
The reason why I emphasize this footprint definition and the like for like is because this has been the case for a couple months now, I believe. I've lost track of time. But even now, when I talk to clients and I talk to some professionals, some architects, they're still operating under the old definition that the like for like means a limitation on the actual total square footage of the house. And it's simply not true. And it's an important thing because for a lot of the houses in the Palisades, they were undersized. They're quite small. And there's a lot of people too who can build back, and they want to build that bigger because it would make sense for a lot of reasons, and they have the finances to do so. So it's like, in my tiny example of 1,500 square feet, you're potentially losing, what was the difference? Like 600 square feet that you could be doing that you're not doing because you have an architect or a builder or a real estate agent whoever who doesn't know what I just said. And this is not like, now this October, this has been out for a couple months at least now. And it baffles me. I'm like, but you're potentially missing out on and this is only for a 1,500 square foot house. Imagine your previous house was 2,000 square feet, 2,500 square feet. That's a lot of square footage you're missing out on. The other thing that's happened with so sticking with the house itself and the like for like, the city's also made it a lot more flexible. So that footprint, the 110%, is strictly an area calculation, which means that the shape of the new house, the footprint can be anything you want. Okay, so if you had a L-shaped house before, make it a box. If you had a box before, make it an L shape, make it a circle, make it whatever you want.
So I guess if people are looking to rebuild, they don't have plans of the house they used to have. How do they get the footprint? Because that's kind of like what drives what you can do. So how do you document that?
So this is it's a very specific question, which we've had to solve. So there's a few ways. First of all, the assessor's records should have some information about that. The other is that if you have a licensed surveyor do a survey of the property, and they, in their survey, demarcate the previous footprint of the house, that it counts as evidence in the city's minds.
And they could do that if, there is foundations.
If there's
if the foundations were removed.
So then it becomes difficult.
Right.
It becomes difficult, especially because a lot of the houses were built before there was microfilm, which is, records in the city. There have been some surveyors who will say, like, look, if you can show me on Google Maps, like the historic record of what was there, and paired with the fact, I'm thinking of a specific example, the surveyor's like, well, I know this area of Palisades because I operate here all the time for the last 20 years. And I know all these houses are roughly, they're like this, they're tract houses. I can put down what was there before, and I'm good with that. And the city's like, okay, you have a qualified licensed surveyor who's saying that they stand by this, and that's good enough for us. So, is there a little bit of doing our best, all of us doing our best, and that's what it is? Absolutely. By the way, Apple Maps, depending on the specific part that you're in, can be really, really good for this. We actually had a project where the surveyor did an outline based on their in-depth knowledge of the neighborhood, again, tract houses. But what happened was, over time, there was a little bit of addition that was done to that house that probably wasn't filed or something. So there's no evidence anywhere of it, except for the fact that I happened to be using Apple Maps to look at stuff. And I saw that, hey, there's a good chunk of the building that was built out that's like a sunroom looking thing that it's not on the survey. And that changed our footprint, increased our previous footprint size. So I talked to the survey. He's like, okay, yep, I see your screenshots. It's as clear as day. I'm going to update the survey. So now we have a larger like-for-like footprint to work with. And, that does make a difference. So there's also, this wasn't directly related to your question, but the subject of what is the footprint, the previous footprint, is also kind of a gray area. So let's also talk about the idea of square footage in general. When people and this is another example of how things a phrase can mean different things. When people talk about the square footage of a house, to be honest, there's 6 definitions of what that means. There's the true total square footage of the house that's constructed, the livable spaces and the garage. Does it include balconies or not? It's a question still. There's the Zillow square footage, which excludes...
Which we don't know how they come up with those.
And those exclude the garage, right? So contractors in their pricing stuff oftentimes include the garage because they still have to do a lot of the work in it, even if it's not conditioned. Zillow excludes the garage. And so for example, if you have a conversation just between a client saying, I'm going to do a house that's 3,000 square feet based off of Zillow, in reality, that's probably more like a 3,400, 3,500 square feet if you're doing a 2-car garage. And between 3,000 and 3,500 or 3,400 price-wise, that makes a difference. And so those are only 2 definitions. Then we have the square footage of the RFA, which again excludes the garage for the most part. And then you have the lot coverage square footage, and you have the footprint square footage. And then the footprint, which as it would sound like is the footprint of the building, but the footprint square footage also includes any areas that are extensively covered by a hard top. So tiny short eaves that are like 2 feet deep, those don't count toward the footprint. If you have an eave or a projection that sticks out 5 feet and beyond, it counts toward footprint. So I only get into the details because it's like this is a very good example of how when cost per square foot or square footage is thrown around, it means very different things depending on the conversation we're having, and it causes a lot of misinformation.
Yeah, no, it does. And, the gross versus net square footage is different. There's things that you exclude and things that you include. So it's hard to speak the same lingo. You were talking about, like, okay, if we had the fire victim owner had a house that was an L shape, and now they wanted to be a triangle. Can they do that?
Then call me. I want to do a triangle house. That sounds fun.
There is a very famous triangle house in LA.
Yeah.
So you never know.
Yes. So the shape can be anything you want, which is very, very freeing. In addition to that, you can actually move the location of the house pretty drastically depending on how big your lot is. Mm-hmm. But the rule is the same regardless of the lot size. The rule is you can move the footprint of the house by up to 20% of the width and the depth. So let's assume, just for the sake of easy conversation, we have a rectangular lot that's 50 by 100, right? That means your house was, before is located at whatever area. It can move front to back by 20 feet, which is significant. Mm-hmm. The house can move left to right by 10 feet, which is significant. I mean, narrow lots, you're kind of, you build to the setbacks on narrow lots, so you're kind of stuck with that. Yeah. But that, so between those two things, the footprint shape, and the 20%, it's a fair amount of freedom.
It is, and when the notion of like for like came out, after the fires, a lot of people misunderstood that as I have to rebuild exactly what was there before. Yep. And the name is a little bit misleading because it's like, well, it's not really like for like. If I can move the thing around, I don't know, the X hundred, X number of square feet and like move its height, like it has nothing to do with what was there before. So yeah, they should probably rename that a little bit. Another thing that was kind of a big point of conversation earlier on in the rebuilding process with the city was basement counting toward your RFA, toward your floor area.
To the floor area and the like for like calculation. Mm-hmm. Yes. So, when we did our first one of our fire rebuild recordings, that was when the like for like was the old definition. And in that definition, you could not add a basement because that would be putting you outside of the like for like definition back then. Mm-hmm. It's changed. So now you can add a basement and it doesn't put you, kick you out of the like for like, expedient permitting approval process. Yeah. Which is a huge deal because for a lot of people a few months ago, they're like, but my lot's so small and I need more square footage for my, grandkid or like whatever else. And a basement is like the easiest way to do that because of height restrictions. Why can't I do a basement?
Or even, people thinking of rebuilding, potentially reselling in the next few years, mm-hmm. like adding a basement could potentially add, I don't know, another third of the square footage of a property.
Huge amount of square footage.
So in terms of resale, it's like easy money in the bank, when time comes.
And what I've seen too is that generally speaking, basements, even on flat lots, have become more common in Los Angeles. They're not nearly as common in places like Michigan, where you have to have a basement to survive. But they have become more common for square footage reasons, for resale reasons, and also as like, play space for kids. There's a lot of practical things for basements. And to be honest, the decision that the city made to reverse what they did before and allow basements makes a lot of sense because there's the planning department and then there's the building department. And the planning department and HOAs, these people, they're concerned about what we see from the street. We don't want like people to build giant monstrosities that weren't there before. That is fundamentally, I think, at the core, the purpose of the like for like is like we don't want people to just do crazy things. But a basement has no impact on anybody. You don't see it. So like it really should. What they're doing now should have been the case from the very, very beginning.
Yeah. And now a little break for our show sponsors. Are you tired of juggling multiple pieces of software and struggling with spreadsheets that aren't made for the realities of design and architecture in 2023? Built by and for designers and architects, Programma's all-in-one suite of tools has everything modern studios need for every stage of a project. Mood boards, the world's best specification tools, procurement tracking, project management, and more. All smartly integrated, easily shareable, and always up to date, reducing time-consuming double handling and costly errors. Share your work in various formats, from PDF to client-friendly, up-to-date online dashboards. Join the ranks of leading studios using Programma today. Click the Programma link in our show notes to start for free. This episode is brought to you by Chaos. They make award-winning design and visualization tools, and they're really pushing the boundaries with AI. Now, AI is shaking up the architecture and design world, and Chaos is taking a responsible approach. Their tools are built to help architects, designers, and visualization specialists to work faster and explore more ideas without replacing creativity. Basically, Chaos wants AI to make your imagination stronger, not take over. So you get to design with more freedom, create stunning visuals, and stay in control of your work. If you want to see what that looks like, tap the Chaos link in our show notes. That being said, though, so if you increase the square footage of your house in a fire rebuild project, one thing you have to be mindful of is the tax implication of that. Yes. And we're not tax experts, so you have to kind of do your due diligence research on that topic.
Yeah. So the deal is, if you are in a non-coastal zone and you're debating between like for like and a new construction, and we're telling you these things, and also, by the way, the permitting approvals timeline difference between like for like and new construction in a non-coastal area is basically identical. So then the question becomes like, well, then why would I not just do new construction? And it's exactly as you said, is that you would be, so I've spoken with a lot of people about this who are also not like tax attorneys, but they're residents, and there's people who've done their own research. And my understanding is that when you exceed, the previous square footage, you get taxed differently. So if you're doing a like-for-like rebuild, the first 100% of the square footage you build back gets taxed the same as before. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't change. The additional 10% you're doing gets taxed at from what I understand, a higher rate, but not the rate of like a new construction project. When you go beyond that and your new construction, the property gets reassessed and now you're taxed much higher. I don't have numbers to give, and I wouldn't give it on the show anyway, but I know that anecdotally, for people who are on a tight budget construction-wise, they have partially chosen to stay within the like for like because they don't want to be in the higher tax amount, and they don't want to, it's too much for them.
Yeah.
So for whatever that means.
So that kind of like squared away, a few questions that people might have lingering. Now, let's say I'm a homeowner, I lost my house in the fires, and I'm looking to rebuild, and I'm looking to find a contractor.
God. The Palisades right now it looks like Las Vegas from the like 60s and 50s, like the old Las Vegas, where it's open land and it's just signs. It's signs everywhere. Like
it's weird.
It's weird. It's a very, I get it. Like you would put your sign out there, but also it's
a little bit strange. But what's interesting though is that I mean, mostly you have spoken to a lot of local contractors, right?
Yeah.
And quite a few have actually expressed that they aren't really interested in working on fire rebuild projects.
Mm-hmm. To be honest, what it comes down to for the handful of contractors I've spoken with who feel that way, it has to do with the clients and the likelihood of projects actually taking place. And it's not the client's fault, because of course it's not their fault. Like, this happened to them. But these contractors have their own business. We have our own, but everyone has their own. It's a business. And the amount of time it takes, the conversion rate, let's call it, the number of phone calls you take versus the number of those phone calls actually converting to projects, the contract gets signed and it moves forward and it gets completed, is in our industries for contractors and architects pretty low anyway.
Yeah.
With the fire rebuild and the chaos of it, of the insurance and everyone trying to find information and comparing, apples to oranges to bananas, prefab to custom houses to design build, that ratio of that conversion rate is like half or a third of what it typically is. So there are a lot of professionals who, for right or for wrong, are like, it's too much. I can't. I don't have that kind of time to be spreading myself out like that, knowing that the chances of a project working out are like 1 out of every 30. Like, I just can't do it, and that's understandable.
There is also the whole, insurance to deal with and the timeline of those projects, which might, in some instances, take longer than typical because of the involvement of the insurance. If the insurance gets deeply involved throughout the whole process, it's going to stretch the project schedule. If they pay you out or like make it that they're less involved during the process, then you might just be in a standard timeline. Yeah. But that's something that contractors aren't really looking. They're not really looking to stretch out. The construction timeline.
No, I think that's a really good point. So on that last note, I think clients would be surprised that the professionals, the architect and the contractor, are all on the same page. Like, we don't want these projects to take longer than they need to, for fire rebuilds especially, but for projects in general. Talking about insurance, so like, for people who are like out of the state and don't know anything about what's going on, people now are still dealing with insurance. That's why, I think it's easy for the news and for other non-locals to be like, why is it taking so long? Why is it taking so long? Like, first of all, if you're doing a proper custom house, the design and documentation phases are 9 to 12 months. That's why, if you're doing like a real custom house. Secondly, people are still dealing with insurance. They don't know how much money they're going to get now, and it's October. So it takes time. The other thing, with like the fallout rate that I've seen historically with other fires, and also I've heard happen a number of times with the recent fires in LA, is that there was this idea that people had to get 6 or 10 neighbors together, all in a cluster, hire the same contractor, hire the same architects, gain an efficiency because of that, right? Get the soft costs down if you're using the same soft cost professionals, soft cost meaning architect, engineer, designer, landscape architect, those people. Get the construction costs down because the contractor is going to give a discount and they're going to buy materials in bulk, and they're going to stage all at once, build all this kind of stuff. On paper, it sounds great. In theory, it sounds great. However, again, what happens with these kind of fire rebuild projects is that people decide not to rebuild. Even if at the very beginning they had all the intention in the world to rebuild earnestly, they end up deciding not to rebuild. Why? There's a handful of reasons we've seen. One, people relocate to a different city because, you have to move. So they're now in Manhattan Beach, Hermosa Beach, in Venice, in Santa Monica, wherever, Newport Beach. And they're like, I've been here for like 5 months now. It's not bad. I kind of like Manhattan Beach. I'm super close to the beach. There's volleyball there. It's a good community. It's good vibes. You know what? I don't need the headache of rebuilding. I'm going to find a place here. I've moved. The other reason why is people just get too exhausted with all the stuff that I mentioned. They're like, I can't handle it. They get burned out. They get burned out. Totally understandable. Third, something else happens in their life that they realize that this, I now fully understand that what I'm about to embark on is a serious endeavor, and my attentions need to go to something else, to my job, to my family, to my friend, whatever it is. And there's probably some other reasons I'm forgetting. So there's a lot of the insurance, of course. Finally, I find out from my insurance what I'm getting. It's not enough. Yeah. So there's a lot of really valid reasons for people to step out of doing a project And I don't know what the statistic is, but it's probably pretty high. Like the number of people who at first, in the first 3 months said, I'm going to rebuild. How many of them decided to not rebuild in the last 3 months?
Yeah.
Probably like half or more.
I mean, out of the 7,000 lots that burned in the Palisades, I think maybe about 200 got on the market for sale.
Yeah.
And I think people are still deciding right now what to do.
Yeah.
Like there is the grieving process of what you've lost. There is the negotiation with the insurance and understanding what you're going to get from that.
Yeah.
And then there is like, okay, what mathematically and personally makes sense for me now that I have all that information. Like
it's a huge consideration.
It's a huge consideration.
And so going back to the example of when people do these cluster builds, let's say, people drop out. And so, if you have a group of 6, one person drops out, okay, now the prices go up. 2 people drop out, 3 people drop off. Well, now what? Now half is now we're doing it. And I've heard, again, multiple times, deals like that, even when the architect is signed, the contractor is signed, it falls apart.
Yeah.
And so for going back to the subject of the professionals and the contractors, it is on their side months of time that they've spent, educating people, getting to a point, putting together this like special all this stuff, and then it falls apart. And they're like, you know what? I'm busy already with work in other places. I can't do this.
It's like pro bono time, which is fine if it turns out into something, but if it's not, you can run a business based on pro bono. So, but the interesting thing is that we've heard that from local contractors that there is a lot of out-of-state contractors who are kind of like bringing their sign and their people here. And we haven't heard positive things on that. It sounds like they sign you on, you give them your retainer, and then 3 months later, nothing has happened. So I would say if their price looks really low compared to other local contractors and they are from out of state, like I would probably walk away from it because they probably don't know what they're talking about. I also think that, it kind of makes sense to use a builder from a place that's at least in the same state, so they know like the state, building code, regulation, how to work out inspections and all of that. They don't need to be exactly in the neighborhood that, you're building in, but at least like in the same state would be the bare minimum to me.
It's an interesting thing because I think when we look back on all of this, 10 years from now, the fire rebuild process will serve as a case study, as an extreme example of what typically takes place in a normal project anyway. Yeah. And what I'm thinking about specifically is the amount of second guessing, questioning, and getting, again, a bunch of different information that clients, that process they go through. And now that the pressure is so intense and the constraints are so tight, and there is this all the stuff in the news and on social media and on again, the WhatsApp channels, that it's like really opened the doors. And so it's very tempting for someone to go with an out-of-state contractor. I'm not disparaging all out-of-state contractors or professionals at all, but go with someone like that because their numbers are good. But so like what I would also say, broadly speaking, because my answer would vary depending on a client-specific situation. But broadly speaking, if you're under that kind of pressure where you have tight budget, tight schedule, and those are immovable, you cannot go past your budget, you cannot go past your schedule because you don't have money, like you got to get in, then there's a good argument to be made that that is not the type of situation that allows for experimentation in the design and construction process and methods.
Yeah.
So obviously everyone's concerned with fire resiliency, which is valid. And so as a result as well, there are more fire resistant methods of fabricating a house that are alternative, not common at all. Using concrete or steel studs, whatever things that are, I'm not saying they're wrong, but they're just uncommon with how things have evolved. And of course, if you go and you talk to those businesses, the ones that do skips, structural concrete, what am I saying? structural insulated panels that are made of concrete skips, whatever it is, or you talk to people who do like shotcrete stuff, siding. Of course, they're going to tell you all of the great things about what they do and how it's more fire resilient and this and that. But again, man, there's like 100 other pieces of information that dictate whether or not it's a good idea. And those things oftentimes cost more money, and they might be faster in one regard, but they're going to cause slowness in 10 other ways.
Yeah.
And it's not common. It's not really been done before by these professionals, other professionals you have to engage with. So, you know, again, it's hard to say without knowing someone's specific situation, but I'm generally hesitant to strongly recommend using one of these more alternative methods of fabrication unless you have the entire team has done it like a bunch of times before.
Well, if you're on a tight budget and schedule, it's not really good ingredients for an experimental recipe, you know.
No, and the thing too, the other variable with that is, I would say if you're the type of person where design is very low on your priority list and you intend on using one of these other methods and you're hiring a team that only does that, then that's on paper, you know, I think more likely to work out. If you care about design a lot, highly unlikely, because the people who specialize in those types of methods of fabrication, that is their passion, that is their jam. It's not design. It's this technical thing, which is totally fine. But if you try to take what they do and then pair it with the average high-level architect, they've not done that before. So now you're experimenting. Yeah. And that's where it becomes a problem.
So let's say I decided to rebuild. I have a contractor that I like. I have an architect that I like, but I do have a really tight budget. What can I be doing?
A very good and pertinent question. So,
you're welcome.
One of the things that's challenging with any project is getting started, right? So we have the budget, the schedule, the quality of the scope, and all those 4 factors, and the style of the design. So those 4 or 5 factors are all variables that are pulling at each other like a tug of war. It's like a 5-way tug of war. And as a result of that, it's really difficult for anybody, like the client, to make that first step. Because it's like, how do I make a first step if I have no idea, like there's no sense of grounding? And you're hearing from people like, to build a house, I can do a high-end house for $400 a square foot. And other contractors who are super reputable, have their names everywhere in the Palisades, and you know, they're a good contractor, they're like, no way. It's $1,000 minimum for me to do anything of quality.
Yeah.
Forget high-end, like anything of quality. And it's like, why the heck would there be this massive range of cost? But to answer your question, I think an interesting way to problem solve that we've done that's been useful is to have the contractor or a few contractors give a ballpark estimate, which we in the industry would call a ROM, or rough order of magnitude. It's a phrase we use for construction cost estimate. Give a ROM to rebuild your house exactly as it was before, with, you know, common sense upgrades. Like, we're not doing single pane glazing, we're going to do dual pane glazing. But what would it cost to put that back? Now, there's a few caveats with that. First, it's difficult to get contractors to do it because they don't like giving ballpark numbers like that. Some will be able to do it, and willing to do it rather. That's great. The other kind of way to get there is to use an architect. So, like, for example, it's much easier for me to call 3 contractors or 2 contractors or 1 contractor and say, hey, you know, I know you, you know me, we want to work together, we have a relationship. Quick phone call, do me a favor, like, take a look at this stuff I'm about to send you. Like, just let me know, like, what you think it would cost, generally speaking. I can ask that because, frankly, the way the relationship works is that contractors still mostly get their work directly from architects, mostly. So I have that ability. You know, a client cold calling a new contractor who's already skeptical of the Palisades, like I said, like, no, I'm not going to spend half of my week, you know, doing that. But anyway, I think that's really interesting and productive, especially if the previous house you had any drawings at all and structural information. Then that contractor, if they're willing to spend the time, can give you a pretty decent estimate. And it's not perfect. It might be off by 10, 15, 20%, you know, whatever. But it's like something to start with. And I found that is it's a good start. It's a good reference point. Let me put it that way.
So why would the price of building a home in LA, let's say, ranges from like $400 per square foot to $1,000 a square foot? Because that's like a big gap.
It's crazy, right? So first of all, again, going back to the broader lesson here of understanding that different informations mean very different things depending on context. Words that are used that are misappropriated and used too loosely are high-end, luxury, nice. Like, this doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
So first of all, let's throw that out. Forget that word.
I mean, I guess also you have to put that contractor back in its contractor context in the realm of how do they fit within a box full of contractors, right?
Agreed.
Like if you take the lowest end contractor, well, for them building a house $400 a square foot, it's gotta be luxury, right?
Relative to their compadres.
Relative to the level they're at.
Yeah.
Right. So.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely the case. So on that note as well, what impacts those costs and the builder's profile is whether or not they are a spec builder or a custom home builder. Mm-hmm. Spec houses, for people who don't know, are built, generally speaking, very, very cheaply. Because they're driven by cost. It's done by a developer, and the whole point of doing a spec house, if you're a developer, is to make money. So the more, as a developer, the more money I spend on construction, the less money I make. So if I can build something that sells the same, but I can cut out $200 per square foot, $300 per square foot, I will do that if I were a sleazy developer. And the things they cut out are sometimes things that you don't see. On the outside, in the photographs or in person, okay, this looks comparable. But what's behind the drywall? What's behind the wood siding? What did they use to secure the flooring? All of these things. How's the framing like? All the waterproofing, all hundreds of things.
Yeah. Oftentimes it's the things you don't see necessarily, but that's the thing that you should care the most because
cause the biggest problems.
That's what's gonna make the house, last or not last over time.
And it is unfortunately very common for people to buy a spec house, enter a lawsuit afterwards with the previous owner or the developer and say, I bought this thing. Why am I having all of these core issues?
We saw it on the remodel project we worked on where the house had been like freshly remodeled for the sale. And as we opened up the floor, we realized that the heated floor system was just hose literally thrown between the joist. And the whole team on site was like baffled, like who did that? Like obviously someone who does not care about what they're building, and that's just terrible.
But then again, like on the pamphlet,
but
right?
The real estate photos, you can't see any of that. It looks, $1 million.
So I'm not saying that all spec builders are bad because there are some really good ones for sure. Course. But on paper, I don't know somebody, without their profile. So if I have a client who's like, I want to do a custom house. I'm particular about stuff. I want something nice. I have a contractor who says I can do it for $500 a square foot. Okay, let me talk to that contractor. And I'm pretty smart in navigating a conversation in that I don't disclose what I'm trying to seek. How's it going? How do you work? So do you mostly do this and that? And where do you work and whatever? And then I learned, okay, you mostly do spec builds and you're selling and you're flipping them. And you don't even have an architect you ever work with. I do not want to work with you, and this is not a good idea. Yeah. It's a bad idea.
The other thing that could fluctuate the price per square foot in terms of construction costs is the type of operation that the contractor is running.
100%.
So let's say if it's a one-man or woman show and a couple guys on site, that's a very different business model than if you have a project manager, a site super, people on payroll, project people engineer. Who are in the office, and the main guy, is busy running the business. He's not the one running the project. So all of that factors in how much construction will cost.
Yeah. So like the general conditions, which is, let's say more or less like what it takes to just have the construction operation going for the larger contractors who do, larger in people size, yes, but larger in terms of also like the cost per square foot. They do like really high-end stuff. Their general conditions fee price is much higher. So you could be spending literally tens and tens and tens of thousands of dollars a month just to have the thing going. For getting, I'm not talking about like the actual work on site, but just to have it progressing. And so automatically that's partly why there's a big, like you said, a big difference. And so that does not mean that you can't have a really well done house by all standards while using a smaller size contractor who doesn't have all of those layers like you described. That's definitely not true. However, it is much more difficult to find that contractor than it is to find what I would say a true high-end contractor who will do a really good job. Like I said before, it's easy to find those people. You throw a stone, you can find them. They're going to cost a lot, but they're there. It's also really easy to find like the really cost-effective, cheap contractors who do spec house kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But the middle ground is difficult. So that's a big thing. The materials, the finishes in the house, glazing, you know. I saw a house they had, someone said they have big, 20-foot wide and 9-foot tall, 10-foot tall, 30-foot wide sliding doors. What brand is that? Are we talking about, Skyframe? Are we talking about Awake, Fleetwood? Are we talking about Dorwin from China? Because we're talking about like a 10x difference in price.
Yeah.
So again, it does boil down to the details in a way. Here's the kind of interesting thing that occurred to me. I was talking to a contractor recently about costs and whatever else, and they were remarking about the glue that they use to secure wood flooring to the substrate. And they use a certain kind of glue, which costs a little bit more money per bucket of glue. It was like $30 or $40 more, because it's healthier. It has less VOCs. It's less toxic. And I think that's great for health reasons, obviously, but also it's a really good example of the complexity of a house. There are hundreds or thousands of not just ways of doing things, but components in a house. And the glue is one of them, right? So if you add up the difference in the cost of glue over the cost of a 6,000 square foot house, that's like not a lot, but it's something. You add that up over the course of 1,000 components. That's why you get things that on paper or in conversation, they sound like they're apples to apples, but they're not apples to apples.
Right, so circling back to my question.
Yes.
What do I do if I'm ready to rebuild, but I have a really tight budget?
Oh, yeah. So getting an estimate based on the previous house is super helpful to make it more realistic. The other thing that we do is, again, the budget that makes sense for you is based on many, many parameters, but getting reference images from a client for what they like, generally speaking, for like alignment reasons, but also reference images of what they are expecting at the end as an outcome, quality wise. I'm hesitant to engage with clients who are like, I want this exact thing, because it's not what we do. Yeah. It's not of interest to me. But for the purposes of like the quality of the house, the amount of materials, the amount of glazing, those kinds of conversations, reference images are valid. And again, a lot of professionals are very hesitant to have these high-level guesstimate conversations because, of course, if they say something and then it ends up being wrong, the client comes back and blames them. I get it. But to be honest, to be self-critical about the industry, clients don't know anything. We have to start somewhere. So I do like using reference images for that point, because if someone says I have $400 a square foot, but they're looking at projects that are, I can easily ballpark and guess this is like a $2,000 per square foot project, I'm going to be like, there's no way your expectations are going to be met. So I think that's just another small but important thing that you can do to help just get closer to a realistic number. Then, of course, the truth is there's a limit to all of these things that you hit. There's a ceiling to it very quickly. There's kind of a guesstimate conversation. At some point, you have to have somebody, an architect, just put pen to paper, start drawing some stuff. And right after that, if they have, with the way that we work, at least, we have good relationship with builders, talk to a builder, say, okay, based on what I do have some drawings for you. I have some allowances. I have some material placeholders. I have dimensions. Give me a ROM. And that's like the very first, more real thing that is easier to attain for a client compared to the other two things, because that's becoming a more standard way of practicing. And everyone, including the contractor in particular, is more comfortable with that because it's like, it's based on actual drawings an architect has done. And I'm talking about, in our case, we do that as fast as possible, as early as possible. So for us these days, it's literally after the very first design meeting. If we have something that's roughly works in terms of program and square footage and general gesture stuff, that's enough to start a conversation right then and there. budget-wise.
The other thing that a lot of people have been mentioning, people who are looking to rebuild, is using prefab companies. And the word prefab is kind of one of those words like, high-end luxury that's been thrown around interchangeably to mean 100 different things.
Yeah, so prefab. I think prefab is a really, really good idea. And recently I've done a very deep dive into prefab, and hopefully in a few years from now, we'll have some really exciting announcements about all of that, that space. But for now, it's R&D for myself. And so my point is, as I know a bit about prefab, it is one of the words that's thrown around too easily. Look, prefab means things on different scales. True prefab in the fullest degree means that the vast majority, like 90% of the house, is prefabricated and it's just brought on site. And that could be like the entire miniature ADU thing is like just dropped onto the foundation. That's like one version. Or the house is broken down into smaller but still really big components, cassettes, panels, modules, and those all come in pieces and put on site and then just kind of like tilted up and fastened together. And then you go further and further down to breaking apart the house even more. And what I have seen is that a fair number of prefab companies use the word prefab, but they're more on the latter end of the spectrum, where the house is being broken down into such small components, and therefore also now we are needing more labor on site. That, to me, it's like, well, where do you draw the line of true prefab? Are you still prefab if the client has to hire a fully local team to do 80%, 70% of the typical labor of a normal house? Is that still prefab? Because labor, roughly speaking, is about half of the cost, maybe 40% of the cost, something around there, right? So if like 40% of the cost of the project is still the same because you have local labor, is that considered prefab? I don't know. So it's kind of a slippery slope in that spectrum, and that's the problem I've seen. It's the even getting more specific, the aspect of a house that's the easiest to have it be prefabricated and is almost always prefabricated by all of these quote prefab companies is the structure, the framing of it, right? And the framing can be, again, SIPs, like I said. It could be LGS, which is light gauge steel, so metal steel studs. It can be type 5. It can be a lot of different things. But the structure is the part that's consistently prefabricated, in a shop. And I've spoken with people who do that, and they sell that as a company or as a prefab company or whatever. And again, it's like going to the specialist, like I mentioned before, the shotcrete concrete guys. You're going to a specialist, they're going to sell you the specialist thing, right? They're going to say how much time they can save with the framing, how it's more fire resistant, how this and how that and whatever. And look, all of those are true for that one part of the house. But framing is a tiny part of the house. In one instance, I was talking to a client of a prefab company. I'm not going to name names, of course. And he was like, I'm super interested in this. I'm gung-ho, got it. And he's like, I'm never doing this again, because he did not do his research. He did not realize he would need that amount of local crew. He did not realize that a bunch of other stuff in the house was not prefabricated. Yeah. So, we were talking about before the core and the shell, the foundation, the framing, the drywall, the skinning, and then the build-out stuff. Well, foundations cannot be prefabricated. Foundations are done on site. So let's say the framing is prefabricated. You have to tilt up cassettes. So framing time goes down by 50%. Cool. Drywall has to be done on site because you cut drywall on site for the most part. All the interior build-outs in the example I'm thinking of, that was all done. So like when you boil it down in that particular example, the prefabricated part was like 10% of the project.
Yeah, which I mean, like every bit matters in terms of schedule and budget, but at some point it's also sometimes adding more time to the schedule, working with those prefabricated kind of like special items, because if you've never worked with them, the contractor has to get familiar with how that system gets put in place, when it needs to get put in place in the sequence of construction. Yeah. The architect needs to understand like how does it work, so everything else around it could work with it, and that just adds up time.
The challenge is that For the most part, there are these two distinct separate camps. There's prefab and then there's not prefab. And again, if you're a client and you can choose one of those camps and you're set on that, that's great. So if you choose prefab and you're like, yeah, design, again, I'm good with having design that's close enough. I'm not going to tamper with it. I'm good with whatever other things that limitations, then it's fine. But it's when people try to like bridge the gap to try and get the savings of that, but the quality of that, it doesn't work. The same thing applies to design build and on, design build on one side and traditional on the other with an architect. I'm going to use design build for cost savings, but hire my own architect and have them work together. It doesn't work.
Different business models.
The information is different. The business models, everything's different. So I think prefab is a phenomenal idea. There's some companies that are decent, some companies that are horrible quality. And the thing too is interesting is the true prefab companies that are actual prefab, not like the sketchy thing I described. The ones that do decent design, right? They do good. All things considered, it's good design. They pencil out to not being a whole lot cheaper than a custom house.
I think it saves on time because everything happens in basically a giant warehouse.
Yeah.
So everything's really clean, really organized, and it's kind of like factory chain work.
Yeah,
in
absolutely.
some ways, right?
Yeah.
Like you don't have a crew that's being split across like 5 different sites and the schedule and waiting for materials and stuff. It's like everything's there. It's just an assembly chain and a kit apart, right?
Yeah.
I think the schedule is probably the most advantageous thing by doing prefab.
Provided you're not going to tamper with it, though.
Provided you're picking what's in the catalog and that's it.
That's
like
it.
You're not
doing
trying to make it a somewhat custom thing.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's totally true. It's just the complexity of houses makes it difficult for these alternate methods of like truly collaborating, I feel.
But I also wonder like the prefab in terms of resale value. Like once the house is brought to the site, wrapped up, touched up and everything, and move-in ready, can you tell that this house was built off-site? Can you tell it's prefab?
Some of them are pretty good. I mean, look, my biggest concern with prefab is design quality and actually execution. Sometimes they're like really it's like if it's factory built, like corners should be clean, man. Like why are these?
They put reglet everywhere and like bullnose style and all that stuff. It's kind of like, I mean, I guess you don't want to spend any time figure out that detail, but come on.
That's also the distinction.
It's a little like bulky on the edges,
Bulky. No, that's actually a really good word to describe like prefab stuff in general. And I will also use that same word to describe cheap, modern architecture and cheap architecture to begin with. Like things are bulky, and things are bulky because you don't have a precision builder. Mm-hmm. And so when you have bulkiness, it allows the team, the builder, let's say, and the architect to like hide things that were not done correctly. So when you have giant thick baseboards and molding and all this stuff, it's to hide imperfections. That's partly why it's harder to. That's why we said before in the show, it takes a certain kind of builder and framer to do a modern house where it's clean lines and things are meeting perfectly, because you have to be close to perfect from the inside out from day one. Cheap modern, again, all that stuff you stick on are traditional. Doesn't matter, man, because we have all these things to hide.
Any closing remarks?
Just that, we'll probably do another one of these recordings, I guess, in the future. 6 months. Obviously, we're always open doors for people who have questions about any of these things. It's worthwhile doing your due diligence up front as a client, I think. It's also, I would say, and this is somewhat contradictory, if you are a client, be mindful of the fact that for the last 9 months, you have probably been exposed to too much information.
Yeah.
And I say that because what happens for anybody when you're exposed to too much information about something you don't know, you inherently start to not trust anything, which is totally understandable, especially given the fact that insurance companies are just like evil people, apparently, and they just don't care, that your level of trust just goes down. But, and I don't have an answer to this, but I think at some point, if you're doing a project with somebody and you're committed to them, you kind of have to like breathe and say, okay, I have to trust who I've hired. Because if you continue the mindset of constantly being in fear and mistrusting people, even if it's based on reasons that were out of your control, like the fires, you're in for a bumpy ride. And the reality too is, we've outlined on here in a lot of different ways how things are done differently. And we've also talked about how some of them don't make sense. But the truth is, when it comes to, for builders, but especially the architects, more the creative side of things, different architects and different designers practice differently. And at some level, tier of professionals, it's not right or wrong. It's just a different way of working. And so in the beginning, when you're trying to decide what to do, these big decision lanes of, prefab, design, builder, typical, and what contractor and whatever else, those are big decisions and categorically different. And you can compare them. You should be comparing them and thinking about them, the matrix of information. But once you get going, at some point, it's not healthy or productive to constantly be thinking about alternatives, because at some level, again, like I just said, there's just different ways of doing things.
Yeah.
So it's a tricky process. Again, any questions though, reach out. I don't have anything else. Want to give us an outro?
Me neither. Thank you very much for watching and listening to this episode. If you like what we do, please review us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and YouTube and everywhere else you can find the show. You can find us on social media, Instagram, Second Studio Pod. We have the website, secondstudiopod.com, where all of the episodes are listed. There is more in that series. If you go to the Project Companion tab, you see a whole series to kind of help you navigate the whole process of working on projects and with architects and consultants. And if you have any questions, any feedbacks, you can contact us with the hotline 213-222-6950. If you call, it goes to voicemail, and if you text, it goes to David's phone. So
but I don't pick it up. It goes straight to voicemail or text. I think it does, at least. That sounds good. And our office out there, which is Fame Architecture and Design. I think Fame Architects is our website, and Fame_Architects is our Instagram handle. So reach out. Appreciate you guys listening, and more to come. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.